Y'all, thank you so much for being with us this afternoon. We are extremely pleased to represent Neogen GeneSeq. We basically have our entire beef team here with you today in partnership with several folks from American Angus. We will have Dr. Steve Miller, Kelly Ritalik, and Dr. Dan Mosier joining us for some of the question and answer sessions. Jill and I would really like this to be a comfortable conversation with customers and friends today. We've got a lot of information that our team's going to share with you. Jill will tell you a little more about the details. I'm kind of looking around the crowd to see. I've got Dr. Kenny Stauffer, our Beef Genomics Director, is here. Wave at them, Kenny, so they'll know who you are. Tom Schultz, over all our genomic programs in Lincoln. And glancing around the crowd, we'll find our three regional managers with American Angus. We'll have with us this afternoon Chris Jeffcoat, Jake Pickering, and Drew Feller. And y'all, you'll see them up in the crowd. You got some good question cards. We're going to use some cards today and ask you all just to raise your hand if you have a question. Someone will pass it down to you. Write them down. They're going to bring them down to the front, and we'll work your questions in as we go through the presentations, if that sounds fair. Got a lot of information to cover. We've got some folks we'll identify as we see them drifting in. But suffice it to say, it's a great pleasure for us to be with you today. We've enjoyed a partnership with AGI, American Angus Association, frankly, since the Fort Worth Convention. A lot of us have been on the road trying to reach many of you. There are only 8 or 9 of us scattered across the U.S., so if you haven't seen us, it's not because we don't love you, we just hadn't been able to get there yet. I want to mention a couple of guys and the excitement that we have about genomics. When Jill introduces the team, we'll have one fellow missing, Rick Fortmiller from Kansas. Are there any folks from Kansas and Nebraska that Rick Fortmiller calls on in the crowd? Y'all don't be bashful, just wave your hands. Rick came to us with a great story earlier this year that relates to what we feel are the importance of genomic testing. He said, Ashby, I've got a cattleman, a customer that came to me and said, Rick, do you realize with this tool, I can now design a herd of cows in the life of a cow that took my dad the life of a cattleman. Is that soaking in, folks? The genetic progress that we can make with the tools that we have available to us today mean in 8 or 9 years, you can create a designer herd of cattle. And it took Dad and Mom maybe 60 or 70 years to pull it off. So to say we're excited about genomics, Jill, would only be part of the story. The reason we're so excited, we truly believe with the great genetic database that the American Angus Association now has. Can anyone tell me how many genotypes you have in your database? Y'all don't be bashful. You can shout out 500,000. 500,000 genotypes. That is more than any other, perhaps all the other beef breeds in North America combined. The only breed that has more genotypes than you is Holstein. They've got about 1.5 million. So when you hear some of these new investigative SNPs, these new exciting areas that were mentioned in the seminar today, like fertility, feet and leg structure, our confidence level in being able to deliver those to you is because Holstein's already doing it. It's just a matter of numbers. You remember from the seminar in Fort Worth, data is good, more data is even better. So keep taking those phenotypes. You're going to hear a lot more about feet and leg scoring tomorrow from some of your American Angus representatives. I don't have to tell you people it's important. Data is critical to the competition for the future, for the center of the plate and our protein. Good friend of ours, one of Jill's friends and customers down in Texas, Donald Brown, says it beautifully. So you don't have to do all this stuff and collect all this information, keep all these records. but you've got to compete with the people that do. So thank you for your attention. I want to thank you as Angus breeders for your commitment to genomic testing, for capturing all that data that make our genomic test valid. And I want to tell you that because of your aggressive work, you not only now are receiving the power in a test for $37 that you used to pay $95 for. Remember just a couple of years ago? Your $37 Angus GS test is basically as powerful as what you were paying $95 for 2 years ago. Because of your aggressiveness, you've not only brought that cost down, but you've created an opportunity to test all the animals in your herd. Capture those maternal traits and data so that we can make even more rapid genetic progress. So, as usual, I say a lot more than needs to be said. I'm still watching for a few folks to arrive, and actually I'm not. I see the bashful little guy hiding out in the corner over here. Chairman Jim Herbert, stand up here and wave at this crowd. I think many of them met you at the seminar. This gentleman's been a friend of mine a little over 20 years. He might not claim that, but I do claim him. You heard a lot of nice things about him in the seminar earlier. He received a tremendous award from the American Angus Association. I know he's genuinely grateful. You need to know he is a cattleman in his own right down in Jill Ginn's area in Texas. But I also want you to know what I love about this guy. If you look at the growth of Neogen Corporation, Jim Herbert has an innate ability to identify issues or problems that we have in our agricultural industry and then find a company or a product that will address that problem. And by putting those two things together, Chairman Herbert, you have built a really nice Neogen Corporation, and we're proud to be part of it with you. Thank you. Jill, tell our crowd about what we're going to do for the next 30 minutes or so.
Okay, well, good afternoon, folks. It's great to see everybody here today. It's my pleasure this afternoon to introduce you to Dr. John Patterson from Montana. We have Mr. Gary Felger from Missouri and Ms. Dee Dee Haynes from Oklahoma. This team of genomic territory managers for Neogen is going to talk to you today about body condition scoring and how you can use that as a management tool to assess the production efficiencies in your herd.
Thanks, Jill. Folks, I'm originally from Indiana. I talk real fast, so I'm going to warn you, if I start rattling on real fast because I'm nervous, just wave your hands and tell me to slow down. Like Jill says, I live in Missouri now. I run some cows in Missouri, so this is real-world stuff to me. We're going to talk about body condition score for a few minutes. It's not rocket science. When we talk about body condition score, we're simply evaluating these cows on their visual appearance. Sometimes with some of these girls in here, they're a little hairy, so maybe we need to put our hands on them to see just how much fat's there or if we can feel some bones. But this is not rocket science. We're just making a genetic prediction or a visual prediction of how these girls are based on how much condition they have or how much fat or how much lack of fat. There's several reasons why we want to do body condition scores on these cattle, but probably one of the most important and most economically impactful reasons is the fact that if we've got cows that are a little thin at calving time, they're going to continue to lose some condition as they're milking this calf and raising this calf, and we see these thin cows don't breed back as fast. So it's really critical that we make sure we've got mature cows at least at a body condition score of 5, heifers at least at a body condition score of 6. And an example we've got up here, if we've got a cow that's a little thin at calving, so she maybe doesn't come back into heat quite as fast. Maybe she comes back into heat 20 days later than what we would expect her to begin with. Her calf at weaning is 20 days younger at weaning time. If we assume that these calves, when they're with mama running on grass for the summer, they're gaining about 2 pounds a day, that 20-day younger calf is going to weigh 40 pounds less at weaning. If we evaluate these calves at about $1.50 a pound, the cow that was just a little thin at calving all of a sudden has a calf that's worth $60 less at weaning time. So now if these girls are significantly thinner at weaning, Maybe she doesn't return to estrus for two or three heat cycles. Then all of a sudden we're looking at maybe $100 to $200 less than the value of that calf. And sadly, a lot of times these girls just don't breed back at all. So it's really critical that we make sure these girls are in the right condition going into calving. In addition to the fact that we want to make sure these girls are breeding early enough, there's other considerations or other factors that we want to make sure these girls have the flesh on, because if the girls are too thin at calving, sometimes they don't milk as well, so we get less pounds at weaning time. We've also seen that calves out of thin cows have immune systems that a lot of times are compromised. So now all of a sudden we're treating more of them for scours. Maybe we're dealing with more respiratory issues. And the other thing is occasionally we'll see girls that are out of thin cows or even out of extremely heavy cows have more dystocia issues or Cavanese issues. So we want to make sure we got these girls kind of in that 5 to 6 range going into calving time. Normally we think of body condition score. Are these girls getting enough groceries throughout the summertime for spring calving? Are they getting enough hay and supplement throughout the winter time? But there's other issues that compound this whole body condition score thing. One of them is simply, are we having some herd health issues that can impact body condition scores? Parasite load. If we've got a lot of internal parasites and we didn't treat them, or we didn't treat them with the right product, or we didn't give them enough product, all of a sudden we got wormy cows that are thinner. Another thing we see is age. On our farm in Missouri, we've got a 17-year-old cow this year, and for the last few years, she has really started to show bones. You know, I can always see her rib cage, at least the back couple ribs. I can see her spine a bit. Her hook bones are showing out a lot more. We know with humans, as we get to about age 40 or older, and so I'm looking forward to this. In another couple of years, I'm going to be 40, JP. And they tell us as we get near the age of 40, we start to lose muscle mass. I think the same thing's true with cattle. I don't know what that age is, but I can tell you as we get these cows at 10, 11, 12 years of age, it does appear to be the case. And the other thing is, if we've got heavier milking cows, excuse me, I need a drink of water. With heavier milking cows, they have greater nutritional needs during the time they're nursing a calf. Research has also showed us that these same heavier milking cows, even when they're dry, have greater nutritional needs. So that's another consideration we need to keep in mind. If you've got cows that are heavier milking, they probably need a few more groceries even when they're not nursing a calf. As we look at, thank you. You're a good man. As we look at body condition scores, we're generally looking at scores on a range from 1 to 9. 1 being very thin cows, 9 being very fleshy, fat type cows. Ideally, as I mentioned before, we want these cows at calving to be about a 5. We want heifers to be at about a 6. And it's interesting, as we go through a lot of data, 95% of the cows in the herd are generally going to be between a 3 and a 7. I can say in my herd, I don't think I've ever scored a cow as a 1 or a 2. I may not have even scored a cow as a 3. I don't think I've ever had an 8 or a 9. So I think this holds true, at least it does in my herd. And so as we look at this, the one thing that's interesting, we find that on the average cow, and of course this varies by frame score, but on an average cow, if we've got a cow that's a 4 and a cow that's a 5, the difference in weight is about 80 pounds. So if we're 90 days from calving, and you identify you've got several cows that are 4s for body condition score, you want to get them to a 5 before calving time, it tells us we got to get about a pound a day onto these girls before then. So John's going to talk in a little bit about how we can do that and do it somewhat economically. As I'm looking at cattle and I'm doing the body condition scores, I'm looking primarily at 5 different traits. I'm going to look at the rib cage of these girls. I want to see if I see any ribs at all. I'm going to look at the backbone. I really don't want to see the backbone in these cows. We're going to look at the hips, see if that hip bone is really protruding out quite a bit. We're going to look at the brisket fill and the flanks, see is there a lot of fat deposits in there. And also we're going to look at the tail head. My friend and coworker Tyler Gray reminded me last week, cows put on fat from the front of the animal to the back of the animal and from the top of the animal to the bottom. So if you're looking at your females and you see a lot of cows with a lot of fatty deposits over the tail head, that's near the back of the animal, it tells us those girls probably have plenty of flesh. Same thing as we're looking at the brisket. If we see a lot of fat in the brisket or down in the flank, once again, it tells us these girls are probably plenty fleshy. If we could go to that table, and we did not put the complete table up here, but this is just some of the tools that we use when we're evaluating cattle. If we could go to the next slide. Because of the fact that most of the cattle are going to probably fit in that 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 range, the two traits that I spend the most time on my farm looking at are the ribs and also the backbone. If I start to see 1 or 2 ribs, I don't get too concerned. But if all of a sudden I'm starting to count 3, 4, 5 ribs, I know these girls need some groceries. And the same with the backbone. If I can't visually see that backbone, I don't get too excited. But once I start to see some backbone, it gets me concerned. In Missouri this summer, we had a pretty bad drought. And throughout this summer, I was constantly looking at these girls trying to see, are they getting too thin? Are we, because our grass was getting pretty sparse. But anyhow, we've got these resources available if you need them. At this time, I think we're going to take a look at a few females. And JP, if you want to make some comments on these girls also.
Thanks, Gary. 2 cows, we've got a little bit of variation in them. 1 thin cow and 1 cow that's got a little more body condition on them.
Okay, JP, this first girl is the cow D cow. You can see just a slight amount of hip in her, just a little bit of the hook bones. But what's your thoughts on her?
Well, the first thing that I look at is I want to see what that tail head looks like. See the cow in the front? See how that tail head is kind of buried down in some fat versus the cow that just walked to the front. That tail head's a little bit higher. So I'm making my first cut or first estimation based on what that tail head looks like. Second one would be to look at the spine. Now this first cow here that's looking at you, if that spine's pretty sharp and I see the ribs, I'm pretty well convinced that I'm going to score her as probably somewhere in that body condition score of 4 versus this cow in the back, that back is a little flatter. I don't see the spine, a little more condition on the flanks. So I'd condition score her close to a 6, okay? So
yeah, we debated on that girl a little bit, and that's one thing JP and I were talking about earlier. If you just have one person out there doing it, and in my case, it's usually me doing it, but it really is helpful if you have 2 or 3 sets of eyes when you're doing the body condition scores because people see different things, and then like JP said, in your case, you guys just average them at the ranch.
that's right.
But Dee Dee's going to let out these next 2 cows, and they may be just a little bit jumpy. John, what's your thoughts on her? I'll go get the other one.
Look at this cow. She's pretty wide. She's pretty flat across the back. That tail head is down. So let me ask one of our real good cattlemen in Montana what he would score. Sir, what would you score her? He scored her a 7. And I would have scored her maybe even a 7.5 or close to an 8. Okay?
How about that second one, John?
Maybe not quite as fleshy as that cow. High 6, low 7, somewhere in that range. And because of that controversy, oftentimes I'll ask people to body condition score with a couple to 3 of you to condition score, and then you'll average that. Let me ask a married couple here that works together all the time. Sir, you in the black hat right there, what would you and your wife score this second cow? I think you ranch in North Dakota, is that right? Okay, what would you score her? 6, yeah, I'm kind of with you, about a 6 on that. See, ma'am, did you agree with that, by the way? Yeah, okay, sorry, I didn't mean to do that.
They almost always get along, John. I can't figure that out.
I know. So yeah, a 7 at least, and then a 6, okay? Once again, looking at the top third of these cows, and gives you a pretty good idea of what their fat deposition composition is in that cow. Okay, Gary?
Sounds good. JP, you want to carry on with your discussion?
Yeah, one of the things you've got is if this little cow was a body condition score of 4, and I've got 100 days to calving, The reason I'm telling you this is because 100 days to calving, she's a body condition score. Maybe only 40% of the cows that are in that condition score 4 are going to come into estrus within 80 days. You get them on a yearly cycle. Versus that cow that's a 5 or a 6, she's going to be ready to go within less than 80 days. 90% of those kind of cows are going to return to estrus versus 40%. So the issue is, well, what kind of a ration do I need to put together? And I just made this up. I wouldn't feed this, but to demonstrate a point, the thin cow, that condition score 4 cow, 25 pounds of grass alfalfa. 8 pounds of concentrate. She's really needing some energy versus the adequate cow that's in a 5 or a 6, 28 pounds of grass hay, 1.5 pounds of corn. So that thin cow is taking 5 times more concentrate energy to get her body condition score up. She needs to gain 1.6 pounds a day. The cow on the right, she didn't need to gain anything. That's a challenge though. You get her to a condition score 5 or 6, don't let her slide into calving losing weight because that's really bad. That cow that was a 7, 100 days to calving, you're feeding her quite a bit of hay. Be careful, don't let her get up to an 8 because they did say those real fat cows have a problem with what? Calving, absolutely. They have a difficulty in calving, and then when they calve, they lose a ton of body fat and they won't come into estrus on you as well. So all I wanted to say was it takes about 5 times more grain concentrate, costs you an extra $50, okay? So be careful. If you need help, if you want a little help, come by the booth. I'll be glad to talk to you about some nutrition. Would I feed all my cows 8 pounds of concentrate a day? What would be the smartest thing you could do? Sort them, okay? Just feed the cows that are thin the extra grain and keep the other cows on hay. It's economically the best thing you can do. I got to tell you, start now. Sail into calving with those cows in adequate body condition. What's the worst thing that's going to happen to these cows in January? Rain, snow will just take all that energy and they'll use that to maintain body heat. You're not going to move those cows in really cold weather. So that's why I say financially it's better to start now getting those body condition scores changed. And with that, Gary, Dee Dee, sorry, your turn.
To summarize what my 2 partners in crime just talked to you about, the body scores of your cows at the time of calving is one of the most important factors that will influence when they will resume heat and how likely and when they will breed back. It's very important not to lose body condition from your calving to your breeding season to ensure that you have a successful rebreed back program. Cows that are fed to maintain body condition scores from calving to breeding tend to have on average a 94% pregnancy rate, while those girls that will calve in the similar condition score but can lose up to 1 have about a 73% score. But my boys forgot to talk about the boys. Don't forget your bulls. You need to take a look at your bulls prior to the breeding season. A young yearling bull needs to have a minimum of a 6, while a more mature bull can have about a minimum of a 5. Also, if you're trying to play catch-up or feed to improve those condition scores, you need to look at 2 things, your management as well as your genetics. And with that, I'm going to ask Kelly if she would like to have any input on that.
Is this on? Awesome. So thank you guys for that. For your body condition score from your association standpoint, the way we would use those body condition scores in your national cattle evaluation would be alongside your mature weights, right? You can take your mature weights plus or minus 45 days of your weaning date on those calves. So either 45 days prior to weaning or 45 days after, that's your window. And you do have to report a body condition score alongside, right, those mature weights. Because we could have a lot of cows out there that might weigh 1,400 pounds, but if we have a 1,400 pound thin one versus a 1,400 pound fat one, that's a big difference, right? And we want to be able to attribute that in your genetic evaluation for those mature weight EPDs so we can start getting at some of these cow efficiency traits. And so once again, that's kind of how we incorporate this data into your national cattle evaluation. If you have any questions about that, make sure you stop by and see us at the AGI booth. So thank you.
Thank you, guys. I'm going to turn it back over to Ashby and Jill because I don't like microphones.
Thank you, Dee Dee, and thank you, Kelly Ritalik. Let me recognize Kurt Kangas over here. He thought he was hiding, but I spotted him in the crowd. Kurt, let the folks know who you are. I believe you're responsible for keeping Tyler and John Patterson out of trouble up in the Northwest, aren't you? I was going to ask you, how did the professor do? All right, we won't reveal how the student did. Professor, you done good. Done good. Jill, have any questions worked down to you? And don't forget, y'all, if you'll get these questions cards from our beautiful Vanna White scattered around the room, we'll pass them down front. I believe, Jill, you told me you had some body condition score.
I've got a couple here. The first one is, Dr. Patterson, what if my cows are at a body condition score of 8?
Be careful. If you start to bring that down, well, an 8 or more, question, we have a veterinarian with, well, 2 veterinarians with us, is calving difficulty or being able to pull a calf because there's so much fat around the reproductive tract. But if you go into calving, she starts calving, she'll start to dump a lot of fat. And I gotta tell you, I think the thing you're gonna have to face is you're gonna have to give her some protein. Specifically a protein, the bypass protein like distiller's grains, something that degrades slowly in the animal. That'll make that fat come off a little bit slower and you won't get into a problem with reproduction. I tell you, there's a couple of things that are on my mind that I'm wondering about right now. Fetal calf programming. If I let those cows get too thin, what's the effect on those heifers long term? Rick Funston's data at Nebraska causes me some pause to say they may not be as productive or as fertile as they could be if you've not taken care of them starting in the 2nd trimester of pregnancy. The other data, and you noticed up there that I put minerals on there, the other data out of Oregon State University says if you don't provide them some adequate minerals, we get into a problem with those calves. So it's involved in fetal programming, the health of the offspring, the health of those heifers. So fat cattle, yeah, bring it off slowly. Other things, make sure you got a good mineral program to go with them. Jill?
Okay, got one more for you. When is the best time to check body condition score?
Well, obviously the best time, and Kelly gave it to you 45 days prior to calving, or prior to weaning. But for me, I'm looking at the day they are going to calve, and I want to back up 100 days. And so that might be November, might be December. I hate to go past that because of the cold weather. It's financially more advantageous to start doing that late October, November after weaning. And so that's where I set my strategy. Okay, she's a 4 today, and I got to get her to a 5. Ooh, 80 pounds of gain. Ooh, she's a 3, I got to get her to a 5, 160 pounds. So I just do that. How many days divided by what I need to have her gain? Okay?
Next one is, what is a good mineral program?
Great mineral program would be, for a lot in the West, is going to be 12% calcium, 3% phosphorus. What I'm really talking about is the trace minerals, copper, zinc, cobalt, and manganese. You got to have them. I haven't seen very many places in the country as I've traveled around that couldn't use trace minerals. And so don't just use a mentality of snowballs and white salt mineral program that I see sometimes. You got to have those trace minerals in them. Probably in the loose form would be most advantageous. And we've got enough data to show it has a very positive impact on immunity. That's probably why these heifer calves coming out of adequately supplemented are better than calves coming out of cows that haven't had any mineral supplement. Okay?
JP, class is over, they tell me. Thank you so much, JP, Gary, Dee Dee. Y'all, we've got another session about ready for Jill to introduce, and we're going to try to stay on schedule, but don't feel like your unanswered questions won't be addressed. We should have some time toward the end of the program. Jill, tell us about our next session there.
Okay, guys, you're in for a real treat for this next session. As you heard in the Genomic Symposium earlier, last year, AGI and Neogen partnered on a new product called the Angus GS. That's a genomic profiler that was built specifically for Angus cattle by the Angus Association. So today we have with us, we have a team, and so I want to introduce a team member that's in the audience. We have Dr. Jamie Parham. Jamie's on the front row there. Jamie's kind of our technical support, and she's just a good all-around hand for us. We also have Mr. Tyler Gray from the West Coast, and then we have Miss Ashley Russ from Minnesota. And so they're going to talk to you today about the Angus GS and how you can incorporate that into your program.
Thank you, Jill. As we go into this discussion about how to apply some of this stuff, I'd just really like to point out how important and how different this Angus GS test is than any other breed association has out there right now. And there's two reasons why the Angus breed has their own custom chip and nobody else does out there right now. And the first reason would be your leadership. Your leadership really engaged and grabbed onto new science and new technology, saw where this was going, and utilized reason number two. And reason number two is just strength in numbers. You simply have the genotypes, you have the amount of tests coming in, and that's a huge deal because if you look at it from other breeds' perspective, you have a tool that nobody else does, and you're going to be able to identify things that we weren't able to identify very quickly with phenotypes. And that's incredibly important, and we're just at the beginning of what we're identifying and what we're utilizing from that standpoint, but I just want to reiterate how important that is to have this test because no other breed has it, and that definitely puts you in the driver's seat, and it also gives your customers the most value you can possibly give them. Today I want to talk specifically about how to apply the Angus GS into heifer selection. And the first thing we'd like to say is that you really have to go out there and still select heifers. Your first cut is still going to be based on phenotype. Whether there's health-related reasons, you've got one that's chronically lame, whether you have some that just didn't make the cut in terms of growth and performance and health, you still need to cut those. Not that they couldn't test well genetically, or you probably already have some kind of idea what they're going to do from a EPD standpoint, but simply it becomes a management decision for you to cut those heifers out and not have to deal with them down the road, because obviously something environmentally did not allow them to express their full genetic potential, and therefore it's just best to not spend the money on them and let them go. After we've done that, we want to go ahead and take a sample. That's kind of our next step. There's 3 different kinds of samples that we will accept. And the first one I'm going to talk about is called a tissue sampling unit, or what we'll refer to as a TSU. This is our hands-down preferred method, both for the lab and from my perspective in the field. When I go help people take samples, this is the easiest way to do it. We really blow through the cattle, and it doesn't affect them at all. In fact, I was taking some samples for a guy and scanning them into the computer at the same time, as well as giving long range while they were pregging heifers. And the only time they waited on me is when I had to rechange the long range bottle. So I can go right on and doesn't slow you down, and I think that's pretty important. The other 2 things is a blood card and a hair card. And I just wanted to point out that from a parentage issue standpoint, if it's a twin, we can't have you submitting a blood sample. You're going to have to refer back to either a TSU or a hair card for a twin. So I just wanted to put that out there, kind of a logistics thing. The tissue sampling units, the TSU is new for some people. So I'd like to bring in my friend Andy Dorn. He's with Allflex. They're a great partner of ours. And he's going to go ahead and kind of show you how we take a tissue sample.
Thanks, Tyler. And as Tyler said, I am Andy Dorn from Allflex, and we have a very good relationship with both the Angus Association and Neogen GeneSeq that's lasted a long time. So as Tyler said, you know, the TSU is fairly new to the beef world, but to It's been around for quite some time now, and now we're getting things more and more perfected. Get out of the way here. The first thing that the people ask me, and I know we get a lot of questions from, is when do I take the sample? My answer to that is when it's convenient for you. When you have something coming through the chute, if it's weaning, if it's at branding, if it's at birth, as long as the calf's dry, you should be good to take that sample. And that's my answer, is when it's most convenient for you as the rancher. We're going to have my little assistant here, Ashley. I'll have you just load it. Is that all right? It's already preloaded. I don't know if the camera, you might want to come up here. This is the applicator. It's got the twist end on it. And as you can see, the TSU's on there, and there's a little edge there. This TSU sits right in there perfect. Just like that. You'll twist the cover over it. Maybe. It's like that. And then go ahead and set the cutter. And you'll feel that cutter grab a hold of the sampler. The red clip comes out. There we go. Now, you've got a hole in there. I like to take it on the top or on the back side of the ear. You can take it in the front, whatever's more convenient. Just like so. We lost the cutter when she jerked her head, but the applicator maintained just fine. You can see that we have a sample in there. I don't know if you can see that. It's very, very small. The camera can. A little smaller. There's a green ball in the bottom. That indicates that you've gone through it and the sample is sealed. Once you have it, give you that. There's a couple ways to record it. There's a barcode on the bottom. There's a visual number on the side. And that barcode can be read by a barcode scanner that Ash was getting with an EID reader in it. The new thing that if you saw this morning on Dr. Bach's slide, the EID and barcode reader all in one. Read it into an app that gives you all the animal's information all together right there. And you can export that to a CSV or an Excel file. Now in the case of this one, I believe she's already got an EID in her. Nope, just a visual tag. So you would correlate that visual tag to her TSU number. Thank you. Give me the match pair set. The other preferable way to do it is you can buy it all in one set, where this is an EID tag, a visual tag, and a sampler, TSU. In this case, the EID and the tissue sampler are one number. They correlate. And this visual ID number is also on the tissue sampler. This gives you one thing. You only have to read one thing. You can read the EID number, and you're all good. Then that correlates to your tissue sampler. And you'll have a CSV file that has the visual tag. So, Tyler, with that, taking care of the sample.
All right, sounds good. Thank you, Andy. So first, I'd like to thank Andy. We have a great partnership with Allflex. We work very closely hand in hand because a lot of it is we have to be matching the identification up, and so we rely heavily on Andy and his team as well. The next thing I'd like to point out is that all these heifers were provided today by Fred and Jay Pennick with Wayview Farms. We really appreciate those bringing these cattle out. And we're going to go ahead and pass it over to Ashby while we bring these heifers out.
Y'all, we wanted to take an opportunity to thank several of our partners for helping this go so smoothly. Mike Burris here is with Prefert Manufacturing out of Mount Pleasant, Texas. Happens to live down in central Missouri, but we brought a professional to operate the equipment. Mike and these Prefert folks will tell you this equipment is easy on the cow, easy on the cowboy. And that's what we like to be caught doing, is being very easy with our cattle, using good stockmanship practices. So Mike, thank you, and Prefert for setting up this entire facility for us today. Again, Dr. Miller is going to be joining you, Tyler. I'm going to ask him to come up. He's representing AGI, another strong partner we have with Neogen GeneSeq and the American Angus Association. And y'all, we really appreciate this opportunity. Just as Andy Dorn has expressed, Allflex is a tremendous partner to the service agencies in genomic testing. And Andy's pretty special to us. I worked with his dad for a lot of years down in the Southeast, and that's something that's great, is to see this next couple of generations stepping in to lead our industry. And we'll talk about that more in a little bit. Tyler, charge ahead.
Thank you, Ashby. So after you take the sample, you send it in to Angus. Angus batches it and sends it in to us. And at this point, I want to point out that it's 100% confidential. Nobody at our lab knows where that sample came from, what that sample is, what animal it is. So I like to point that out because the one benefit of DNA is not only do we get to extrapolate and find some of these things that we wouldn't be able to find very easily with phenotypes alone, it's also a great place to get a third-party audit. There's no bias. Our technicians aren't looking through and trying to give somebody a better score. It is a true third-party audit, which I think is very important today for more transparency and more confidence within the data. That data comes back, it gets reported. The first thing you'll get is a DNA score. And there's a little bit of confusion with that. And so on just the straight DNA score, it'll say whatever trait you're looking at. Say we're looking at birth weight. And right below that, it has a 5 on there. That means that heifer's in the top 5% of the breed for birth weight, which is a good thing. In this case, it would mean she's low birth weight. So she's in the top 5% of the breed. Same thing with yearling weight. If she had a yearling weight and it came back, it was 15, that means she's in the top 15% of the breed for yearling weight. So that's how the actual DNA score comes back. But to get the GEEPD, the Angus Association blends that along with their pedigree and their actual phenotype ratios, and it blends it all together. So it's good to look at the DNA score that's provided to you, but the most accurate tool you can look at is the actual GEEPDs. That has everything in it, weighted correctly, and that's the place you want to go look. We'll pull up here this, we've numbered some of these heifers out here. We got to look at some of their data before and after. The heifer I want to point out here right now is this 3 heifer. She's one that, she's out in the lead there with the white tag. She's kind of got an interesting story that luckily the herdsman was able to portray to me, is that she was just a little bit off on her timing. So the first thing they did was they sent in a sample, and they thought she was out of Keneally Patriot 04H, and she ended up being out of their cleanup bull, which was Wayview Discovery. So the first thing they found out that the pedigree they thought she wasn't true. And I think that's huge, is that if we did one thing with DNA, it's huge just to make sure our pedigrees are right, because that influences our EPDs to a very high level. So that's the first thing they found out. The next thing they find out is that took her birth weight, she was a negative 1.4, and that moved her up to a 0. So rather than concentrating on the actual numbers, I'd like to say, let's look at the trend. The trend is going up on birth weight. The trend came down a little bit on weaning weight and then back up on yearling weight. So already she's starting to tell me a story, and I can see it a little bit phenotypically. We see this heifer out here, and I can tell, we're looking at her rib shape, her cannon length in her bones. She's one of those kind of heifers that's going to have a lot more post-weaning growth, one that I would say excels more in a terminal scenario, and she does that very well. One thing we also found out is that she's a little bit lower, or quite a bit lower in this case, on her heifer pregnancy. She was, I think the actual number was like a 4.9, but she was in the top 95% of the animals out there. And I think as we start to look at her, I think we see the numbers lining up, and I think we see a little more of that accuracy coming up. The second thing I want to bring up is that her accuracy on those traits increased significantly. And it's different on each trait. It's based on how many actual phenotype records we have and on and on. But let's just look at her marbling. And for instance, she went from having no progeny equivalents to right now it's about 9 progeny equivalents. She has that way before we're even going to breed her. So the value of time and accuracy is huge when we're doing this on Angus females. Unless she was a donor cow, there's not a very great likeliness that she's going to have 9 calves. Next thing I want to point out is there's a couple heifers out here. Actually, one didn't make the ride, but we have the data behind it that they were out of the same cow, but different sires. And the sires were similar in terms of their EPD profile. They were a little bit back and forth on marbling and ribeye, but overall they were pretty close to similar. What we found when we pulled the DNA test is how it combined with that cow nicked a lot differently, even though the numbers were the same. One heifer went up significantly higher in weaning weight over the other one. We had some differences, some pretty significant differences in carcass weight as well. So I think that's the advantage of taking this DNA and telling us how did the DNA combine to make the most accurate decision today on these heifers. Those are the things you kind of already have heard, and you probably might have known a little bit now. Now as we get into the Angus GS and we're starting to get some more of these novelty traits, I think we need to think about applying some things a little bit differently. There's going to be an excellent session tomorrow on foot score evaluations. I really encourage you to attend it. It's going to be very important. It's extremely important out in the field. I get to talk to a lot of commercial producers, and every one of them asks me, what about the feet and legs deal? I mean, they're asking, when is the EPDs coming out? How do I know if these animals are going to create lame cows when they're 4, 5, 6 years old? It's a big deal in the country. Right now we have a research EPD, which means it's not published on these girls' pedigree. Let's pretend for a minute that it is. We look out here at these heifers' feet scores. There's nothing that just absolutely stands out for you. So let's take this heifer, the slick heifer, and this heifer next to her, this one marked with the 2. And let's look at them and say, you know, when we're doing the actual phenotype scores on them, they're coming out very good on their foot scores. But let's just pretend for a minute that she has a fantastic foot claw and foot angle EPD, while this number 2 does not at all. In fact, she's in the bottom 10% of the breed, pretend. If we had those EPDs in front of us, yet phenotypically, we can't separate them. So what we're going to do is be able to make faster progress knowing that this heifer is going to pass on better feet, even though the feet between this heifer and that heifer is not any different today out here in the pen. So now we have the power to identify genetics that will actually pass on these traits, even though we don't see the phenotype differences. And the same thing if you find a bull, as down the road, once we get enough of these phenotypes in to have a production EPD, if you have a bull that excels for foot quality, but for some reason he got acidotic, he's too good of a doer, and he's crippled up because of his feet, genetically, he will pass on good feet. But environmentally, if you're running in tough country, he's still going to lame up and not breed a lot of cows. So it's a little bit different compared to some other traits we're used to dealing with, because if that yearling weight EPD bull that's 143, if he doesn't actually weigh 1,300 at a year of age, that doesn't really affect his breeding ability as much. But with the foot score, it will. It's going to be a big deal. So there's some different ways we need to be able to manage different traits. And as we get more novelty traits, these are going to be things you guys are going to have to adapt to a little bit more and are going to be able to utilize in different capacities. If you were in the genomic symposium earlier, Dr. Stuart Bach hinted towards some of the data that's coming out, some of the novelty traits that we're getting closer on. Here we have Dr. Miller from AGI. I asked him to go through some of that from an association perspective. Dr. Miller?
Thanks, Tyler. Yeah, we had, after the symposium, actually, we had our communications group had organized a Facebook Live session. So Stuart Bach and I sat down on top of that Purina trailer out there and did kind of an interview and went through a bunch of questions So if you, apparently that's going to be available. You can watch it later and rewatch it and things like that. So I won't repeat a lot of that, but just kind of touching on the kind of special traits. So when we built Angus GS, you know, the markers that go into the evaluation, they're all on the chip, which is great, but we also put other markers on there. Markers that have been shown to be related to things like meat quality, and it's kind of an interesting story. There's a researcher at the Menum Research Center working on the trait dark cutting, okay, and he's found a SNP that looks to be really significant for dark cutters. And he says, actually, it's on a lot of chips. It's actually on Angus GS. It was one of those SNPs that we picked that was related to meat quality that we put on there. We didn't know about his research at the time, but it's actually showing now that that's related to dark cutting. So that's, you know, it's that kind of content that we've built in there. A lot of the content's to do with fertility. So we talked about it last year. We've been looking at these, what we call fertility haplotypes. When Dr. Bach talked this morning about Pawnee Chief, it's something like that, but that we suspect is in Angus cattle. And we've got extra density in those regions on the chip. So the really, I guess, beautiful thing, if you're a scientist, and I'll call out my colleague Duke Liu in the back there, he's brand new with Angus in the black hat there. But Duke's been here since July, and basically, you know, how you guys might like to handle cattle, Duke likes to handle data. And the one thing we've got at Angus is a lot of data. So basically taking all those Angus GS genotypes, heifer pregnancy records, and looking at relationships between all the SNPs and heifer pregnancy. And we basically see some really clear what we call peaks on those Manhattan plots. So those are significant regions. You know, one of the questions that I had, Stuart put me on the spot with the Facebook Live is, well, when are you going to turn something loose to breeders? I said, well, we got to get it right, you know, the first time. So a bit cautious, but I would hope that this time next year we're talking about something like that.
Thank you. We'll go on to the questions. Like they said, if we can pass them down, pass the cards down.
If any of y'all have any questions, we've got guys up in the stands waiting to take those for you. Dr. Miller, I have one question here already for you. I'm going to direct this one to you. This one says, how does Angus GS affect the single-step ranking of animals?
Yeah, absolutely directly, I guess. So the way the genotypes, you know, all the genotypes, when we think about the Angus evaluation now, I think this morning it was 556,000 or something, Dan updated it. All those genotypes really impact the evaluation in the same way. I'll come back to maybe how Angus GS is a little bit different, but it impacts your genomically enhanced EPD because it changes the pedigree relationship. So, you know, you are half your mom, half your dad, and a quarter of each of the grandparents, but the DNA will tell you that actually you didn't inherit exactly a quarter from each of your grandparents. You inherited some more from one grandparent than another. And so how do EPDs work? Well, each of those 4 grandparents might have very different birth weight EPDs. Did you inherit more DNA from the grandparent with a higher birth weight EPD or more from the grandparent with a lower birth weight EPD? And that's essentially how the genotype gets used to affect your EPDs across all the traits. Right? The difference with Angus GS now is in the past we have genotypes in the database that are what we call low density, and we have to figure out their 50K. We call that imputation, and that's highly accurate. But with GS, we basically put all the SNPs on the chip, so we don't have to impute those genotypes. So the genotypes themselves are really called on the chip and not imputed. That's the difference.
Thank you. I had a question. If I genotype my animals, can I stop turning in weights and phenotype measurements?
At your peril. So that's a message I try and get out all the time. That, you know, so when Duke did that analysis with all the genotypes, heifer pregnancy, and I guess Stuart pointed out, you know, we had Dr. Wells showed the human data, and we had peaks 3 times higher with our heifer pregnancy data. There's more information there. Right? It's the data is what drives our ability to predict anything. So as soon as we take phenotypes out of the equation, it'll all unravel basically.
Okay. Awesome.
So I've got a couple questions here. The heifer 1 and 2 data that we had up on the slide are these actual Angus GS scores. They're actual GEEPDs affected by the Angus GS. Angus GS was a part of those tabulations, show those 1 and 2 together. We put that data together. Unfortunately, that number 1 heifer that I showed on the data didn't come today. The number 2 heifer on the data was the slick heifer, and I'd be more than happy to bring her out, but her half sib didn't make the trip, so you couldn't quite evaluate 100%. Total side note, but the slick heifer that was heifer 2 is that really good, really nice heifer that I'm told she's going to Louisville next week, so I wish them luck on her. She's pretty nice. These other questions are actually going to go right back over to Dr. Miller. A lot of these are going to be evaluation questions, and this one is, how do you adjust desired birth weights for the different parts of the country? I.e., in the north, there's an 85-pound calf, where in the south, that calf would be lighter, male, female, those types of things. That's the first question.
Answer that one now. Yeah, so your evaluation, it's all about EPDs, right? So if you compare a bull that's 0 and 2 on birth weight, then you're going to expect 2 pounds more in the calves from the +2 birth weight EPD. You as producers know your environments, right? You know the type of cattle that are going to work in your environment and the trait levels that you want, and then you basically got to use the EPDs to match those levels to environments, basically. Whether that's birth weight or milk yield, cow size, what have you.
Another one here that I can kind of start and then you can kind of finish
Sure.
is fertility depends on so much of management. How is a number assigned? And that is the trick, right? I mean, the first thing, if we're talking specific to Angus EPDs, fertility is a broad statement. If you just say fertility, that incorporates way too many things, and there's a lot of finicky things in there. When we look at the heifer pregnancy EPD specifically, I like to show guys the heritability, and I believe on the Angus website it's a 0.13 heritability for heifer pregnancy.
12 or 13, I think, yep.
12 or 13. So we compare that to a different trait that we have a lot more data on, such as yearling weight or carcass EPDs, and those are going to be pushing up more in the 40%, upwards of there. So I think this statement is correct. There's so much that goes into fertility, and that's why we haven't been able to capture it as easily as we can, things like growth and carcass. Growth and carcass are much more highly heritable, and we can track those down much quicker and create contemporary groups and sign that down. That's the exciting thing about the Angus GS is, like I said, we could maybe get there with phenotypes alone, but it would take a lot of cattle, a lot of expensive testing, because by the time she's open, she's already cost you a lot of money. And that's the advantage of the Angus GS, that we can come in and look at the actual genome and see some anomalies. And I think that's where Dr. Miller was talking about the Manhattan scores that Dr. Bach referenced earlier today.
Yeah, so heifer pregnancy is obviously maybe half the heritability of a lot of the growth traits, for example. So there's a lot of environmental factors that can play a role there. The other reason it's problematic is a threshold trait, right? So if you've got a group of heifers and they're all pregnant, well, there's no variation there. So the genetic evaluation can't really use that data. Likewise, if they're all open, hopefully that's not the case, but there's no data. There's not really any data there either. We need some variation in the group. There's got to be, this heifer beat this heifer, just like if the weaning weight, this heifer beat this heifer. So that's another complicating factor with heifer pregnancy. But having said all that, there is power in the data you've turned in, because if there was no power in the data, we wouldn't get the genomic analysis results that we get, and we wouldn't get the spread in EPDs that we get. So there is genetic differences there. They're just hard to pull out based on phenotypes alone, just due to the environmental factors. But we can apply EPDs, and we can make some progress. The real hope, I guess, the hope and what's being delivered on now with genomics is it's going to help the harder traits more than some of the other traits. So, growth rate, we're doing a really good job with growth rate before genomics ever showed up. But heifer pregnancy, and these traits are a lot harder. You select a heifer because she actually got pregnant at a year of age. Well, that's good, but what was her actual genetic value, right? So now with genomics, we're actually putting a lot more data behind that heifer that EPD is a lot more accurate than it would have been just based on her record with a lowly heritable trait alone. And that's where you can make a lot of progress.
I have a question here. It reads, if I have 4 bulls very close in genomic numbers, and I keep crossing these bulls in each other's daughters, am I going to progress, regress, or stay the same? So the first thing I want to address about this scenario is genomic numbers. I referenced it in when I was speaking. I would really look at the GEEPDs. That's the most accurate thing you have. You can look at the DNA scores, but hands down, let's go ahead and use something that already has the pedigree, the actual phenotypes, and the DNA all incorporated. So just to clarify, I'm going to go forward using genomic numbers as the GEEPDs. And then I think that creates an interesting question. Well, if you keep crossing those back and forth, will you progress, regress, or stay the same? DNA does not make a program. The things that we need haven't changed for a long time. Fertile cows that raise big calves, the carcass quality, these things don't change with DNA. None of that. The DNA is not going to make the program. All it's going to do is enhance what you already do. That's the difference. We're just trying to do what you already do more accurately. So just because you follow the DNA, does that mean that you need to always shoot for top 1% carcass? Not if that's what your customers aren't demanding. If your customers are simply demanding the most maternal Angus cows out there, then the Angus GS still helps you identify those within your herd. So progress, regress, or stay the same is very subjective. It depends on your goals. It depends on what makes your customers money. That's what matters. And all this is doing is icing on the cake. You've already came and you've brought the biggest thing and the most expensive capital to the game. You've brought the registered cattle, you've put in the data, you have the phenotypes and the contemporary groups, and you have a program behind whatever you do. That's the big part. We're just coming in with DNA to help you do what you already do. We aren't a program in itself. We just help you do what you do a little more accurately, a little quicker. Hopefully that makes sense.
I might jump in with something related to that, which I hear quite a bit, okay, we have genomics now. If we select on these genomically enhanced EPDs, we're going to fix all the good genes, and then we won't make any more progress because our bull will just be homozygous good. But in reality, there's lots of genes that are influencing these traits, and there's a lot of variation. And so we can be happy with how much progress we've made in genotyping animals, but if we look over to the dairy industry, like you mentioned, Holsteins has actually been at this for 3 or 4 years longer than we have. They got a lot more genotypes. And since genomics has actually come into the dairy industry, they're making more progress, right? And one of the comments at the time was when genomics first came out, well, you're gonna chase all the same genetics and you're gonna narrow your genetic base. Well, actually, it lets you expand your genetic base. Because you don't just look at it's not just some cow family anymore for the dairy breeders. I can genotype all these bull calves and find a great one. I don't have to just go back to the same cow family that I'm confident in. We can actually cast the net wider. So genomics actually allow us to maybe capture more variation. And as for, are we going to run out of variation that we won't make any more progress? The other species have basically shown it's continually up and up.
Tyler, we have time for one more question.
Okay, there was one here that just said, will endo-phi fescue tolerance be available?
Oh. Yeah, so on there's a project looking at hair shedding. So we do have hair shedding data. It is on, we've got a list of EPDs. I guess if I'm going to say what's going to roll out next, we've rolled out foot score. We're working on PAP, and that's what we're going to see next. At Denver, we're going to have a workshop and have a research EPD for people to look at. Longevity based on the survey is right up there. We do have the hair shedding data, and that is on the list as well.
I just have one more. I'm going to throw this one at Andy right quick. It says, how long is the sample good for before you need to send it in, and how does it need to be stored to be mailed?
Yeah, sample care. So, excuse me. You'll take your sample, and if you're going to, you can keep it in room temperature for up to a year, and that means like in a desk or a filing cabinet, not on the dash of the truck in the sun. This is the start of a science project, right? So you got to take care of it, just like anything else. But up to a year, it's good in room temperature, out of sunlight. And if you're going to wait till after a year, go ahead and put that in a non-defrost freezer, if you will. We don't like it to be freeze-thaw, freeze-thaw. DNA doesn't like that, right? So it's the freezer that at my house where we keep all the frozen pizza that we're always open and shutting, we don't want it in that freezer. Maybe it's in the barn freezer that you don't open and shut all the time. That's acceptable. And then how to send it in? You can do it multiple different ways, but the most convenient way is to get the trays from GeneSeek. They've got blue trays that you can send them in. They're 96 trays. I think they see all kinds of things from one in an envelope to one in a Ziploc bag, but the trays are the most acceptable. And then as you go, just make sure that you have the data that you need with your sample. If it's 1 or 1,000, especially at AGI, they need the animal ID to correlate to the tissue sample. So that's the best way to do that.
Okay.
Thanks.
Thanks, Andy. All right, guys. In the last presentation that we have today, I have Ms. Hannah Garrett and Mr. Kevin Mernon. They're both from the Rocky Mountain region of the United States, and they're going to be here today to talk to us about PAP scoring and how you can use that to manage risk in your high-altitude herds.
Thank you, Jill. I appreciate that. Nice introduction, and Dr. Green as well. My name is Hannah Garrett. I work for GeneSeek covering Colorado, Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, and Wyoming. I spend a lot of my time high altitude or in the desert. And high altitude disease is something we're going to cover and something that's pretty near and dear to my heart because it affects a lot of cattle producers that I work with.
And I'm Kevin Mernon, and I cover Montana and Idaho, once again kind of in that Rocky Mountain region where we get to see that little bit higher altitude cattle.
Who here lives at an elevation higher than 5,000 feet? Okay, so a couple of us. So we probably have a familiarity then with high altitude disease and how it affects the cattle producers at higher elevations. Who has ever felt like this? I ran all the way here and my breath hasn't caught up with me yet. I feel like that right now, I promise. My heart's beating really fast. So this is ultimately what cattle at high elevation with a high PAP score feel like. And I will define what a PAP score is. High altitude disease has many names: brisket, high mountain disease, dropsy, high altitude pulmonary hypertension. And ultimately, what it is a disease caused by an animal's lack of oxygen. And this results in the overworking and remodeling of the heart. The heart is a muscle, and when it has to work harder than it normally would to get more oxygen from the blood, it causes changes in the heart. So throughout history, we've identified high altitude disease, and we measure it by something called pulmonary arterial pressure, or PAP. How many of you have heard the term PAP? Okay, it's getting more and more familiar every day because we're seeing ramifications of this disease at low and high altitudes as well. So PAP is a progressive increase in the vasoconstriction due in part to a change in the a change in the heart and a relatively fixed obstruction of how the blood flows. That was very scientific, right? So let's just simplify it. Pipe. A smaller pipe and a larger pipe. If you take the same amount of fluid, it takes less pressure to get that fluid through a larger diameter pipe. So think of the heart as a pump that has to get fluid through a pipe. When we change the heart and we decrease the area that blood has to flow through, the heart has to pump harder to get more oxygenated blood to the system. When you take that concept and you apply it at high altitude, where we have decreased oxygen, we can see that when we take the oxygen away, the heart is working harder and our pipe gets smaller. We're going to run out of oxygen and we're going to have issues. This is what's happening inside the heart. Don't read all the words. It's the picture that's important. It's the one on the right side. you can see the changes in the vasculature. There's actually defined as a lesion, but it's really something in the pipe. It's clogging the path. So we can't get blood to the lungs, can't get oxygen. And in brisket disease, or PAP, this occurs on the right side of the heart. So as I said before, a low oxygen environment combined with stress changes the way that our blood flows and our body responds. This is measured by an increased pulmonary pressure. Ultimately, when our heart has to work harder and starts to not be able to catch up, then we start retaining fluid, much like congestive heart failure in humans. We get pulmonary edema, increased respiration, and in some cases, death of the cattle. Traditionally, we saw this and see it at 6,500 feet and higher in elevation. But recently, we have started to observe it more and more in the feed yards at any elevation. Dr. Green told me of some incidences in Louisiana. It's across Kansas. It's in Nebraska. So we're seeing this disease manifest at lower elevations as well. And there's a few causes behind that, and we'll address a few of those. And when Dr. Abbey takes us through a PAP test, he'll touch on some of those points as well. Obviously, if you raise an animal at altitude, just like somebody who trains at altitude, the Olympic athletes in Colorado Springs, we can tolerate it a little better than somebody who comes from Florida and then comes up to the Rocky Mountains. This is a picture of a steer in a feed yard, and it might be a little grainy for y'all, and I do apologize. But in the red box, if you look closely at the brisket area, you'll see the ventral edema, the fluid accumulation that we see and recognize as brisket disease. So we take a hypoxic or an oxygen-deprived environment, we increase our PAP, and we have higher morbidity, higher incidence of disease, and a higher death loss at high altitudes and lower altitudes. So I say that because this is a real issue for high altitude producers and is becoming more common throughout the plains as well. Each year, high elevation producers deal with this. They send their cattle up the mountain and calves don't come back. So it's a loss that they calculate in. So how do they manage it? They do a couple things. They use proven bloodlines. They know which bloodlines handle altitude better and which ones don't seem to work for a variety of reasons. They purchase PAP-tested bulls, and we will PAP. We're going to do a live PAP demonstration today, so you all will see exactly what I'm talking about. Some producers go to the extent of PAP testing their females to identify potential females that may fall out of the herd or give birth to calves that aren't going to last. While PAP testing, when they identify a high PAP animal, they take those calves or bulls and they haul them straight to town at a lower elevation. Some guys are set up, they can go to a lower elevation and graze. Most of the guys I know are not, and they go straight to the cell barn that's off the mountain. So you're probably thinking by now, and if you're not, then think with me, that there's got to be some sort of genetic link, because we talked about how producers use proven bloodlines. And Colorado State University Dr. Tim Holt has done a large amount of work in PAP and the heritability and the likelihood that's going to be passed on. And Colorado State has found the direct heritability of PAP to be 0.34%. Those of you that know PAP testing know Dr. Tim Holt. You have a Dr. Tim Holt trained veterinarian here today to show you the PAP testing procedure. Dr. Ben Abbey is from Dillon, Montana. His clinic is Beaverhead Veterinary Clinic, and he was kind enough to give us a day and a half out of his schedule. So thank you, Dr. Abbey, for being a part of today. Okay, I love science. Who loves science? Oh yeah, some hands. That really excites me. I'm just gonna go through this science list here. These are all of the genes that have been identified that have something to do with an animal expressing high altitude disease and an increased PAP. You guys ready? Okay, who's excited? HLA-DQ-A2, MHC class 2 receptor. I'm just joking. The point of my story is that there's a lot of stuff that goes into this, and it's not a one and done. It's not a single SNP or a mutation or a protein. It's a lot of different factors. It's the genome, it's the environment, it's the nutrition. I'm sure there's some epigenetic modifications, sorry about the big word, but epigenetic changes that we don't even account for because the technology isn't there. So these are all things to be considered when we think about solving this high mountain disease issue, high altitude disease issue. Here's a picture of Dr. Tim Holt. For those of you that don't know him, you can't do a PAP talk without at least a picture or a word from him. And then the guy in the red is Dr. Gittleson, and I know some of you know him. He is also a great go-to in the industry. If you ever get the opportunity to talk to him about high altitude disease, he's a great asset and a wealth of information. So this is my last slide before I turn it over to Kevin. So as a disease, and in seeking a solution to high altitude disease, there are some real boundaries and some real limitations is an appropriate word. One of the hardest parts is the high altitude guys run on leases. Sometimes they're leases with multiple producers, but they're huge. And they send pairs up, and calves or cows or bulls don't come back. And it's just death loss. It's really not feasible or economical, or maybe even fun, to go up to the mountains, find the dead animals, post them if you find them in time, and identify exactly why they passed away. And that lack of data makes it hard to draw sound conclusions on how many animals are actually dying of a high PAP in the mountain states. Like I touched on earlier, there's multiple systems that go into this, making one cause highly unlikely. And correctly identifying those animals that are suffering or dying from PAP instead of other illnesses. I touched earlier on the feed yard steer with the ventral edema, and you can see swelling of the brisket caused from a sulfate deficiency. So there's a couple different things that will cause similar signs and symptoms. So being able to correctly identify what's going on is a huge piece of the puzzle. And lastly, I touched a little bit on the feed yard impact and how it seems like we're seeing more and more of this all the time at the feed yard. Because if you think about it, cattle producers in the mountain regions are a small percent. I read somewhere 2 to 3% of all cattle producers live at 5,000 feet or above. So until we can quantify what high altitude disease and the losses associated with it are costing us, it's really hard to get research support and funding to seek a solution and an answer to what's causing this disease and what's really going on.
All right, before Dr. Abby gets up here and actually performs a test here, I'm going to go over a little bit on how we do score the PAP. There's a lot of different factors in terms of what influences the score of these cattle. One of the big ones being age. We like to see those cattle, over 12 months of age. But as those cattle get older, that does lead to an increase in their PAP score. Obviously, genetics is a big influencer on there, but also the elevation of the PAP site or of the test site. Excuse me. We like to get those test sites up to 5,500 feet and above. Higher the better to get the highest accuracy, most easiest repeatable tests. Some other factors that go into how these cattle score is if they've had any prior illness, any respiratory issues, that's going to affect and elevate their scores, as well as if they've been through some different forms of stress prior to testing. So just in terms of kind of a basic on how to read these scores, if these cattle are tested at 5,500 feet, this does change with elevation, but if these cattle are sitting in this score from 30 to 40, at that 5,500 feet mark, they should be good. They should be good to go up into the mountain. When we get into that 41 to about 45 range, a little bit more risk, and as we go up higher on the chart, higher risk in terms of exhibiting symptoms of PAP. One other big thing is if we're going to bring some cattle from some lower elevations, up to try to get a PAP score. We want to get them up there and give them some time to assimilate to their environment. At least 3 weeks. Longer the better to give them a chance to assimilate to get an accurate score on them. One of the big things, if there's one big picture thing to take away from, interpreting these scores, we want to get those cattle up to higher elevations, up to that 5,500 feet mark and above, to get that highest accuracy, most repeatable test. The higher the better for these cattle to be safe to go up to these higher elevations. When we drop down, for
Probably if you just right
testing
the table.
down in these lower areas, and the repeatability goes down, the risk goes up in terms of these cattle ability to survive going up into these higher elevation regions. And with that, Dr. Abbey, are you ready?
Yep.
Well, we're very, very lucky and very fortunate to have one of the best in the business here to give us an example of this test. Come from my home state in Montana, and I'll let you take it away, Dr. Abbey.
Okay. Thank you very much, Kevin. So the biggest thing with PAP testing is getting the animal in the appropriate position and making sure that the chute's appropriately set. You can think of someone giving you a big old bear hug and what that does to your pressure in your chest. It's not very helpful. So go ahead and just take her around. So typically what I tell the cowboys to do is just have the chute as tight as your cinch. So there's enough room to slide your hand between the neck and the head catch, as well as the neck and the sides. Then we're going to disinfect the neck with a combination of chlorhexidine and alcohol. The needle that we insert that we're going to use to allow our catheter to flow in is a 3-inch 12-gauge needle. And you can think of this procedure just like going to the hospital and having cardiac catheterization there. So, and then we advance the catheter through the needle. And if you remember back to the picture of where we're going down the right jugular vein. We're passing through the right side of the heart, and we're going to end up in the pulmonary artery. We use the right ventricle as a measurement to evaluate where we're at, as well as the height of our transducer. Because we are measuring a pressure, that transducer needs to be at the level of the pulmonary artery. In the initial parts, we look at the pressure wave to evaluate, one, our location, and two, the height of our transducer. So if we look at that, we're in our right ventricle, and we have that big steep curve. And what we're trying to do is bounce the bottom line off the bottom, so that way we know that it's zeroing out at the appropriate place. Once we have our transducer at the appropriate height, we're going to advance the catheter into the pulmonary artery. And if you notice, our slope changes to our line. And we had a really nice place there, and then it kind of got flat. So what happened right there where our line's getting flat is I've actually advanced it too far, and we're getting a pressure where that catheter is wedged into the lungs, the arteries of the lungs. So we're going to back that up, and we get more of a nice ski slope kind of hill. And then she's got a pretty short pulmonary artery, so we're going between being wedged and the ventricle. So in there we have a nice pulmonary artery wave. We know our catheter's in the appropriate position, and her PAP score would be 33, with her systolic being 41 and her diastolic being 22. And that's all that's involved in the procedure. A couple of the things that I want to talk about is because we are taking a catheter and going directly into the heart, we use a number of different disinfectants to try and prevent infection and endocarditis. So we use a mixture of chlorhexidine, scrub in solution, as well as for our wash, we'll use betadine scrub in solution, and then do it in chlorhexidine, and then soak it in chlorhexidine and alcohol. With the EPD coming out for PAP, I think it's very important to remember our accuracies. And what is that EPD representing? So if we look at this, 5,500 to 7,000 feet, we have a very good repeatable value. But we do have to take the age of the animal into consideration. Typically, I tell producers once they've reached sexual maturity. So bulls at 12 months of age, 12 to 18 months of age, it's not going to change very much. But if we're trying to test bulls at 10 months of age, it will change before they reach 12. And then the elevation. So right here we've got a 75% repeatability. And you can see we've got more, the scores are more usable when we do it at an appropriate elevation. So let's flip to the 4,000 foot slide. You didn't put in the less than 4,000? Okay. So here we've got, if a bull PAP's 46 at 4,000 feet, we don't want to use them at 55. We really almost don't want to use them at 4,000 to 5,500. So it really shifts that graph to the left with our ability to utilize that bull with confidence.
Thank you, Dr. Abby. And now we'll turn it over to Kelly Ritalik to address the PAP EPD, and then we'll open it up for questions on our question cards. So if you have questions, start writing them down, and we'll get those gathered up.
Awesome. So thank you, guys. That was an awesome demonstration. That was something that I witnessed and experienced for the first time this spring, and it's quite the event when you see a whole slew of them get ran through and get PAP tested. So I commend these breeders on what they're doing. So the one thing that we're working on at the American Angus Association is actually creating an EPD for these PAP scores. So we're getting a collection of data in from our members. We're collaborating with folks at Colorado State University as well as Dr. Tim Holt to basically set up specifications around this data, get that data into the evaluation, and then basically reproduce an EPD for our members. And so we're hoping by January around the National Western Stock Show that we'll have a research EPD release for this PAP EPD. But the one thing I do want to caution breeders from speaking with people that have way more experience with this particular phenotype than I do is that even though we have an EPD, this is probably one of the most important traits that we still need to think about the actual phenotype with, okay? Because it's unlike weaning weight or unlike yearling weight, something like that, where if we're off a little bit or our phenotype gets hurt because maybe that calf got sick, something like that, if we send a calf, right, that doesn't PAP well to high altitude, this is now a life or death situation, right? And so even though we're going to have these genetic tools, which will allow some of our high altitude breeders to maybe bring in genetics that maybe they couldn't or didn't know the value of before, we're still going to need to PAP test those cattle to send them into high altitudes, right? Because we don't want to send them up there, lose a bunch of cattle, and have a really bad fall when we try to gather them back up. And so that's kind of our update on PAP. If anybody has some questions about that, we're more than willing to answer them. But again, we want to thank Neogen GeneSeq for being here today.
Kelly, I've got kind of a follow-up question while you're there that we just covered up. PAP is just one part of the story on feedlot death loss. Have you identified any other causes of sudden death and perhaps genetic markers to identify them?
Sure, yeah. So we talk about some feedlot death. We've been seeing some feedlot death. The one thing that we want to make sure of is that we don't have a strong correlation between high altitude disease and feedlot death. And that's something that we really need to keep in mind. We don't know if those two traits are the same trait. There's still a lot of research that needs to be done to figure out, why some cattle may be having trouble in lower altitudes. And so we want to caution and be careful that we're not kind of grouping all these things all in one, because we really just don't know yet. And so that's something that, we'll continue to focus on and something that we'll continue to research. But at this time, there's not a strong association between high elevation PAP and what some people have been seeing in the feedlots.
Kelly, this one kind of goes along with that. It says, can a post-mortem on a low altitude feedlot death identify pulmonary disease as the cause of death?
Yeah, so there has been some feedlots that obviously do post some of their cattle. When they open them up, obviously if they do have a pulmonary issue, you can look at the heart. I know there's been some groups that have actually went into the feedlots and scored hearts. And basically what they do during that function is how big is the heart, right? If a heart's bigger, right, it doesn't have its natural shape. Obviously it's been working a little bit harder. And so there's going to be an unnatural shape there to that heart. And so that is some of the delineation that our vets can make when they post those cattle.
Thank you. Okay, so I have another one here. It says, does a PAP test have to be performed by a vet? Anyone?
No, but there's really no lay people doing it. And really across the nation, there's only about 6 vets that are performing it. So the availability of people to do it is not there. As well, there's the specifics of the test need to be there. If they aren't, it's not an accurate test.
The next one kind of goes along with that. It says, where can Arizona people get PAPs done on their cattle? Do we know anybody in Arizona or somebody that would travel to Arizona?
Probably the best thing would be to call Tim Holt at CSU, because he's got the list of vets doing it. And I'm not sure if there's someone down in New Mexico that would come down there.
Or about mid-January, February, you'd be ready to get out of Montana.
Yeah, call me up. I'm ready to come down when it's minus 40.
Dr. Abbey, if you will, I passed Dr. Abbey a couple of others that are kind of management PAP test related, if you would.
Our ranch is at 4,000 feet. Is there any value in a PAP score? Can it be scaled back based on lower elevation? And I utilize this question a lot because it's what are we using that PAP test for? Are we using it to evaluate that animal's performance at elevation? And no, we can't do that because we don't have enough challenge for it. But the question we can answer is if that bull tests high at 4,000, we know that he cannot go up there. So if a bull PAP tested normal at 4,000 feet, I would have to advise you to take that bull, sell that bull to that person and have that bull PAP tested at a later date once he's been at the elevation he's going to work at. And secondly, do your high-risk cattle have problems later put on feed at lower elevation? And this one, I don't know that I've seen a paper. Hannah, have you seen any research as far as consequences? The thing I like to remind producers about with a PAP score is that it's just like you going to the doctor and the doctor saying you have an increased risk of heart disease. Just because you have that increased risk doesn't mean you're going to show it. And if there are so many things that affect the lungs, and I like Hannah's analogy, but I like to take it a step further. So the heart is a pump, and just like an irrigation pump or a hydraulic pump, it's trying to pump blood or fluid through a filter. That filter is the lungs. So anything that clogs up that filter is going to cause pressures to increase in that heart. One of the ways that bovine take care of pneumonia is they've got septum in their lungs and they consolidate that part of the lung to try and isolate that pneumonia. And we all know that with BRD. So what happens with the calf that gets treated a couple times for summer pneumonia and he's got a 50 PAP, you know, versus a calf that had a perfect life, never showed any BRD signs, and has a 50 PAP and goes to the feed yard. You know, so there's so many other environmental variables that it's not just a high PAP causing them to be poor performers in the feed yard.
Dr. Abbey, we got a lot of things kind of in this same area, and I've been trying to think of a delicate way to think about some of these folks that left a little earlier, and I know they may have had schedule issues and conflicts, but the delicate part is, I'll just use myself as an example. I'm an older, fat man that occasionally gets short of breath and has a little trouble lifting as much as I used to. I feel like staying here today gave me an excuse not to have to go to my cardiologist anytime soon. And I want you to think about what at our various levels of elevation can tie into some of these questions Dr. Abbey's answering. And here's one that'll open toward that. Needs a real veterinarian to answer it, not me. What are we finding on the similarities between cattle dying at high altitude versus those that are dying in low elevations, such as in the feed yards? The differences contrasted a little bit.
Okay. A lot of the stuff we're seeing in brisket disease is more of a genetic issue. So we classify that as a type 3 heart disease. And then human obesity causing heart problems is more of a type 2 heart disease. And that's what we're seeing in the feed yards, because you know, when prices were low, people were carrying cattle longer. We had an increase in carcass weights. We had an increase in live cattle weights. And at that same time, we had an increase in deaths. So it's more the obesity causing that type of heart disease in the finishing cattle than it is an effect of pulmonary or of oxygen hypoxia.
Okay, so Dr. Abbey, can respiratory disease affect a PAP score?
Yep, and I think we kind of covered that. You know, one thing that, you know, we had a bad fire year here a couple years ago in Montana, and I was surprised that the amount of smoke didn't cause those PAP scores to go up more than they did. Because really I didn't notice any difference in the PAP numbers between a smoky year and a non-smoky year. But a high incidence of BRD definitely will increase PAP scores.
Okay. What is the cost of a PAP test, and when should you test?
So, you know, Tim and I are pretty close. It's about $25 plus farm call. And then, you know, I end up testing a lot of bulls in January, February, right in preparation for sales, because that, you know, just like with our semen testing, we're pushing the envelope between having them mature enough to test for a yearling sale. You know, so it's that balance of trying to get it as close to the sale as we can, but far enough away we can get stuff done and published.
Thank you. This one is for Kelly. Kelly, are the PAP markers for the future EPD or genomic EPD on the Angus GS?
Yeah, so there are some research markers that were identified. I believe they're called EPAS markers that haven't completely been validated whether or not they work. However, those were placed on Angus GS, and so obviously as we continue to test large populations on Angus GS, we can do some of that validation work ourselves. The other part of it too that we can think about as we continue down this road of collecting that PAP data is that we can actually couple that with, and Duke is kind of our in-house expert on this, but couple that with like a GWAS analysis, which is basically we use the data that we have and we do a genome scan, and we can kind of see those peaks, right? Those peaks we keep talking about as geneticists, that picture that you saw this morning with all those dots and those peaks, we get pretty excited about that because that means there's a signal for that specific trait in the genome somewhere. And so we can go through and we can do some of those types of analysis. But at this time, we don't have, you know, the one or the two genes that we know are going to, you know, differentiate PAP to a high degree at this time.
Okay, thank you.
Kelly, I think one thing that I've heard, you know, this is my first Angus Association meeting, and one thing I've heard come up through multiple meetings is that we have to have the phenotypic data. And our PAP test is the phenotypic data to verify that genetic data.
Yeah, exactly. Without the work that you do and Dr. Holt does and all that data, we can't create an EPD. We can't have genetic markers. We have to have the phenotypes.
and this kind of ties into those last couple of comments. Somebody's getting nervous out there. Is this specific to the Angus breed? Mr. Chairman, I got one I can answer. No, it is not. And along that line, Hannah, are you still with us? You got a mic? Hannah made a comment earlier about calves dying with this disease out in their country in the high altitude areas. And I kind of led to a question of, so it is not for any certain age animal. It could occur throughout the age range of our animals.
I'd like for you to comment on this, Dr. Abbey, but if you have a hyperreactor, in most cases, if you do catch them on the mountain, by the time you get them to the bottom, they're going to die. And so this is a little bit of the survival of the fittest, right? If they get it, it's going to, before it's identified with a PAP test, they'll suffer, probably ultimately die at elevation. But you do identify, if you do get them to the PAP test stage and age, and they can still have that higher PAP test and suffer from the disease, and we see it in the feed yard too. So those cattle are older as well. And management's going to have a lot to do with that.
So I've got a really good example herd for that. And this herd runs between 6,000 and 8,000 feet. They buy all PAP tested bulls. And they approached me about PAP testing their females. And, you know, this is one of the only herds I PAP test their females. So I was kind of intrigued. And they're like, you know, we're losing 20 calves a summer, you know, from brisket. And then they also run them as stockers and run them as yearlings. And then they lose another 20 to 30 before they sell them as yearlings. And the improvements that we've made in that herd is a neighboring herd of similar genetics was taking calves down in elevation every week, and they didn't have any brisket calves this summer. But one of the other interesting observations I've had with that herd is that we come into herd, I typically expect 10 to 15% of them to PAP high. And so if you take your open rate of 10% and then a PAP test rate of 15%, they couldn't afford to cull 25% of their heifers. So they started retaining the high PAP heifers and breeding them and using them as a terminal herd. We're on the 6th year of that, and I think there's only 2 or 3 of those heifers left after 6 years that haven't washed out because of being poor performers or coming in open. You know, so I think that's part of the subclinical part of this disease that we don't see. You know, we get so focused on the clinical side of having a brisket calf that dies that we have these insensible losses that we haven't had the funding to address.
Got any more questions there? Jill, any questions to work down this way? If not, let me ask all the speakers, everyone just come on up. Dr. Abbey, did you introduce your son Cooper there earlier? Your able assistant?
Yeah, my able-bodied assistant.
Come on up, Dr. Mosier. You can join Dr. Miller and Kelly. We're not going to throw you under the bus. And Tyler, again, we want to thank the Penix and Josh for y'all bringing these cattle in. They have just been super to handle. We wanted to be caught being guilty of good stockmanship practices here today, and you know, good cattle sure help stockmen look better, don't they? Y'all, if you hadn't engaged in Tom Knopfsinger and Ron Gill and Kurt Pate's stockmanship and stewardship approaches, I'd sure encourage you to. It's just like the preferred equipment. It's easier on the people and easier on the cattle.
Dr. Green? I would just like to express a sincere appreciation to The Ohio State University for providing the cows for our body condition scoring presentation, and Marty Moussard with The Ohio State.
Yeah, as a Lincoln, Nebraska-based company, we probably better be nice to The Ohio State University today. Dr. Long, last night at the Federation Recognition Dinner, Foundation Recognition Dinner, the motto was caring, it's our business. Is that correct? Caring, it's our business. I truly believe that applies to everybody in this room. Certainly you Angus breeders, producers, our team at Nidge and Gene Seek, our allies and partners at American Angus Association, AGI, True Test, Prefert, All Flex. I think Andy Dorn might have slipped out. But y'all, there's an old saying that I think's attributed to Zig Ziglar, one of those promotional guys. People don't care what you know until they know that you care. And I can tell you, for the part of this team that I've worked with, and that's most of you here for several years, these people care. So if you hadn't gotten everything covered that you wanted to hear today, please don't be bashful about going by the Neogen booth, the Angus booth. True Test has a booth, Prefert has a big one. These folks that are here that are our exhibitors and support your convention want to touch base with you. So go by and thank them. Monty, how we're doing, buddy? My old Michigander buddy up there, you know, am I talking too fast or are we getting by okay? I'll try to be slow so you can understand it. Any other questions filtered down? Everyone, thank y'all. You're a great team, and I love the opportunity to work with you. Appreciate it.